Um, Patty Cran says, but Davos Man does not rule everything. Why don't more voters support unions? Why don't more people vote for higher taxes for billionaires?
Well, in many cases, people do vote for people who support higher taxes for billionaires, but Davos Man is especially skilled at fear mongering and at, again, giving us this false binary. I mean, this is a project now that's many years old. I mean, it goes back to in the States to the Reagan Revolution, right? And I mean, Reagan takes office at a time when wages are already declining for working people, and it's very satisfying to embrace somebody who's promising to cut your taxes, and he demonizes government, and huge numbers of think tanks then participate in the demonizing of government, underwritten by corporate interests that benefit from less regulation, and their executives benefit from lower taxation. And this has actually saturated our thinking. I mean, we're confused about the nature of our problems. I mean, look, how is Trump able to take office blaming China for the demise of American middle-class security? Now, China is a subject we could talk about, for its own separate hour. China is a real threat to the global trading system. It's a serious challenge. It's a complex story. But the idea that, huge numbers of Americans, I mean, some, but not huge numbers of Americans, have seen their living standards, decimated by China is just absurd. It's a diversion. I mean, huge numbers of Americans have seen their living standards decimated by decisions made in corporate boardrooms in Seattle, where Bezos is indeed part of a downgrading of wages for huge numbers of service workers, following on Walmart, a company he actually tried to emulate. Decisions made in boardrooms in New York, decisions made in the halls of Congress and in successive presidential administrations. I mean, the idea that we're going to pin it all on China is absurd, and yet that works. And so Davos Man is very skilled at serving up his own interests as all of our interests. I mean, look, the World Economic Forum, which is an institution that I actually dig into in the book, this is an entity that operates under the banner committed to improving the state of the world. This extraordinary claim for an entity that is dominated by a group that, by any reasonable measure, they stand as the ultimate beneficiaries of the status quo. Mark Benioff, who's on the board of the World Economic Forum, actually said out loud on a panel discussion last year at virtual Davos, he said, CEOs are the real heroes of the pandemic. Not frontline medical workers, not the people delivering our food, not parents stuck in home. But it's not a gaffe, though. It's a worldview. I mean, it's not a gaffe because he underscored it. He said, and we did it not for profit, but to save the world. He went on to say, government didn't save you, non-governmental organizations didn't save you, we saved you. I mean, this is consistent with this view that you can count on us to look after your interests. And we've been living through half a century of that kind of thinking, and it hasn't worked out very well. So the fact that people still believe it is a sign of how powerful these notions are.
So Patty's question leads me to my question, and Bill Holstein has the same question, so what do we do? What are some of your solutions to the Davos Man effect?
Well, the big stuff, very simple to describe and very difficult to execute, right? Like, we don't need a revolution. We don't need to get rid of capitalism. We don't need to confiscate the wealth of the Davos Man. We need to get back to what we already had. We need progressive taxation, which will not only provide government with the resources to deliver things that people actually want, like healthcare and affordable education and infrastructure that isn't an embarrassment, but will also restore a sense of basic fairness. We need collective bargaining, so workers, not through unilateral magnanimous gestures like stakeholder capitalism, can actually mobilize to get their piece of the pie. And we need antitrust enforcement so that small businesses can expand, so that larger businesses can operate on a truly level playing field. But to do that, we need to get money out of politics. And, these things are very hard. I mean, Davos Man is not going to just surrender. Davos Man is going to trot out new things like stakeholder capitalism aimed at demonstrating that, he'll take care of this while deflecting attention and releasing pressure to actually deliver. So what do we do in the meantime? Well, I explore the Preston model from the city of Preston in the northwest of England, where, after 10 years of very brutal austerity, the leaders of local communities got together and they agreed that, well, they would at least take their procurement, when they spend to build a new police station, or they hire a company to bring in the meals at the local school district, they would have a bias toward local companies.
Yeah.
So that would at least create more local jobs. It would keep wealth in communities. Excuse me. I mean, that's one sort of middle step. And then, we're living in a time when, thanks to the pandemic, where we no longer have the sticker shock on enormous government expenditures that make something like universal basic income, which is an idea that I have sort of mixed feelings about, but that I explore in the book, that once seemed like a total fantasy, like, the government might just as well commit to handing out a unicorn to every American. Well, now, people like Nancy Pelosi have said, maybe it's time to do this. We've had a form of universal basic income through Biden's tax credits that now for families with children that now are not, going to be continued. So, these are some sort of middle steps that we can take, but really we need to get back to what we already had. And that, again, labor, strengthening of labor, antitrust enforcement, and progressive taxation.
I think progressive taxation and a basic income are like, speaking of unicorns, it just is very hard to get through our political system. And I'm not sure it's the fault of Davos Man. I mean,
but who's financing the campaigns of the people who are in the government deciding what is and isn't politically reasonable? I mean, this idea that somehow Davos Man can be separated from the government, I frankly just don't understand it. I mean, who is financing campaigns, think tanks? Who's hiring the lobbyists? I mean, do we think that all this stuff that we've experienced is just happening by accident? I just don't understand that idea. I mean, the sort of sophisticated shrug idea is that, globalization is so much bigger than any given nation, and automation is more important than trade, and technology is a force that's beyond control. So, it's futile to try to change anything. We just have to understand this, like we're describing the weather system. Well, that's a kind of sophisticated way to do Davos Man's bidding, though it doesn't actually withstand scrutiny. But this idea that somehow, well, it's the government's fault and the government reflects the popular will of the people, and never mind all the money that's flowing into campaigns and the lobby shops that are developing our policies. Like, I just don't understand that argument.
Well, I guess I'm just being a devil's advocate here. What I'm trying to say is that there are other points of view, if the government does any more spending than it has, it's going to add to our inflation problem. Or there's a point of view. I mean, there are people with ideologies that they just don't want more government. There are people who don't want progressive taxation. They don't want, higher taxes at all. They just don't believe in raising.
Well, wait, but you're conflating two things that are separate. I mean, you can't say that you're worried about the deficit and then progressive taxation is going to give us more government, as if these are part of the same thing. Like, why is it that we always seem to have enough money to finance additional defense spending and tax cuts for billionaires, but the idea that we could have national health care in America, well, that's pie in the sky. That's insane. This thing that every other developed democracy seems to manage to finance. Well, what's the difference between the United States and every other developed democracy? It's the inability to tax wealthy people. And why is it so hard to tax wealthy people in America? Because wealthy people control our government. I mean, it's sitting right out there in plain view for all of us to see. So I just push back on this idea that, these are just reasonable policy disagreements and different sets of beliefs. I mean, many of our beliefs that turn into well, it's just politically impossible to deliver on any of the things that huge numbers of people actually want, according to every conceivable poll, that is directly a reflection of the fact that we've internalized Davos Man's narrative, this idea that, if you try to force Pfizer to think about vaccine equality around the globe, well, then we're not going to get any medical innovation. Like, look, we heard this on, setting aside intellectual property on HIV drugs in the 80s and 90s, in the 90s, and that was pure nonsense. We've had lots of innovation, and we've got lots of billionaire pharmaceutical executives. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having lots of wealthy people capitalize on their ideas and do better than everybody else. That's part and parcel of the American system. There is something wrong with huge numbers of people feeling so ostracized from their economy that they glom onto insane conspiracy theories that prevent them from taking vaccines in a pandemic, and they mount an insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th. And these things are connected. We cannot survive as a democratic society with so many people being simply outside of the basic economy that we're living in.